When people are taught politics from a young age, they're usually told this grand story. The story of America, of democracy. The idea that in old world Europe, we were all being oppressed by the evil kings and aristocrats. Nobody was allowed to have their rights, freedoms, and liberties. Nobody was allowed to practice the religion they wanted. And so they had to come to America. And America thought up this great idea: democracy. The idea that the will of the people will decide the government, that the government only can exist as the embodiment of the will of the people, and that this is the fundamental American idea. This is what brought about the American Revolution. This is what created our success, and that democracy needs to be spread throughout the globe, that it's a great idea that everyone should follow. The only problem is most of that isn't true, and democracy isn't really that good of a system. So, today I want to explain three key things. The first being what democracy is, where it came from, who thought of it, why it exists. The second being why it's terrible, why it's just a terrible idea, why it's probably one of the worst ways of running a government. And third, how we get around it, how we work around the problems in the system in order to create something of a representative body without having all of the terribleness of a democracy. So, let's begin. What is democracy? Democracy really is just the will of the people embodied in government. That's the basic definition of it. But what does that actually mean? Well, we all know, because we were all taught at a young age, that democracy means we all go to a ballot box and we put a piece of paper in it and we vote for a process. Or in a process, rather. And in that process, we decide who our politicians are, or who our leaders are, or what our government does. And we've probably heard of other democracies where people just directly vote on what the issues are, or others where the politicians aren't chosen through the same system. But we all know that it's basically this system where everybody gets around, we all vote on something, and that decides what our government does, because it's supposed to be the will of the people embodied. But where does that idea come from? Where does the idea that the government is the will of the people embodied come from? Well, that, my friends, comes from our friend, the worst philosopher of the 18th century, hands down, Rousseau. Now, Rousseau was a very smart guy, right? But his ideas, not so great. Rousseau was a French philosopher in the 18th century who believed in the same social contract idea that was being spread around the Enlightenment time. I've talked about social contracts a lot, so I probably don't have to explain this to you again, but the social contract is just this idea of why we form governments. Why do people come together from the state of nature and form a government? And Rousseau, unlike every other philosopher, comes to a very different idea. It's very unique, very new, very fresh, right? His idea is that in the state of nature, we're all good. This is completely unlike every philosopher. Every other philosopher says in the state of nature there's chaos, there's disorder, everybody's fighting each other, it's just terrible, right? Hobbes thinks that, Locke thinks that, even Kant thinks that. Rousseau thinks differently. Rousseau believes that in the state of nature we are the noble savage, that we essentially are the perfect versions of ourselves. He believes this because he thinks that essentially, society corrupts us. Rousseau hates society. Rousseau believes that society is this corrupting force, that when we're born, we're these beautiful creatures that are perfectly moral and perfectly noble, and that it's just because society teaches us certain evil things that we become bad. Now, this is a stupid philosophy, but let's carry on with it just for this point. Why then do we form a government? Why did these evil people come together to form a government? Well, Rousseau, once again, social contract theory, believes that the reason we form a government is specifically because we want to achieve this ideal state of man. He states this because he believes in essentially progressivism. This is where progressivism comes from. It basically comes from Rousseau. And this is the idea that, well, yeah, we kind of ruined everything by having a society and manipulating children after they're born, but we can fix it, and we can actually go further as long as we have a government that embodies the will of the people and takes us beyond our current state. He says that man is born free, but everywhere he is bound in chains because society binds us. And the point of a government is to get rid of those chains. It's to free us. It's to make us into better people, right? And that the government is really going to come in and just create this ideal state of mankind. So Rousseau's solution to basically every problem is the government will fix it. And so this is where a lot of modern day progressivism comes in. This is where a bunch of different philosophies sprout from, but that's basically Rousseau's ideology. So, what does that have to do with democracy? And why specifically does democracy suck? Well, the reason democracy is terrible is not one reason. There are 4 reasons why democracy is terrible. There's probably 100, but these 4 are the most important ones. The first is the participation problem. The second is the politician problem. The third is the tyranny problem. And the fourth is the division problem. So, let's start with the participation problem. Now, we know from our great buddy Rousseau that the government is the will of the people embodied, that all of us will come together and form a government, and that's going to do everything that the people want, and the people will get to decide what happens. The only problem is, in most democracies, most people don't show up to vote. It's just a fact. It's just the statistical fact that happens. As it turns out, most people don't care what the government's going to do. Most people do not care what the tax rate is on sugar coming in from who knows where, right? It's just most of these problems do not bother people at all. And the reason why they don't bother people is because of this fancy little term economists call opportunity cost. Opportunity cost is the idea that whenever you do something, you're not just doing that thing, right? Whenever I go and work for, let's say, $14 an hour, I'm not just working for $14 an hour. I'm working for $14 an hour, but I'm choosing not to go work somewhere else that pays me $12 an hour. And this makes sense because I'm making more money working $14 an hour, right? But when you choose not to work, then you're losing the $14 an hour you could have worked. And so that's opportunity cost, right? If you spend an hour lying down on your couch swiping on TikTok or something, then you're losing the $14 you could have worked. That's opportunity cost. Now let's say it takes an hour to vote. And let's say in that hour you could have made $20, right? So voting has an opportunity cost now of $20 for you. And remember, this opportunity cost can be massive for people depending on how much money they make, on what they consider valuable with their time, whatnot, how much a policy affects them specifically. So the opportunity cost can be massive for people to go and vote. And so because of that, they just don't care about voting. They don't care about the next policy agenda that they have to vote on. So if people aren't participating in the system, you can't really call it the will of the people. But that's not really where the problem comes in, because frankly, nobody cares if 60% of the people don't vote. People are still voting, people choose to vote, it's still kind of the will of the people. The real problem is that the people who still vote, the people who do participate in the system, can essentially use the system to steal money and resources from the people who don't participate in the system. So remember, $20 to vote, right? That's basically the cost of voting if you could have gotten $20 in that hour. So let's say that 20% of the people band together and they realize, well, these 80% of people, they're all sheep, right? They think they're losing $20 an hour if they come and vote, which is true. So what we can do is we can just steal less than $20 from them and they won't care because the opportunity cost of voting is $20. So if you participate in a democracy, you essentially give up your right to stuff to whoever actually participates in the democracy. Because just because you live in a democracy doesn't mean that you participate in it. Remember, most people don't participate in democracies. Most people do not vote in our political system. And so because of that, you're surrendering your rights to a group of people who are just politically motivated. And when that happens, you usually get stuff stolen from you. So going back to our example, $20. Remember that. $20. Every person makes $20 in our Fantasyland system. Now these 20% of people realize we can steal $10 from the 80% of people. Let's say there's 100 people, right? That means that they can steal $800 from society and just give it back to themselves. And nobody will notice or care because democracy has made it such that every person has an equal vote, but most people don't care because the opportunity cost is just too high. So with an opportunity cost of $20, that means that people would not care to vote unless the benefit they get is more than $20. Because if not, then they could just be spending that time working and making back the $10 they lost. And so we have this worse off scenario for society where if you never had a democracy, this never would have happened, right? If you had a monarchy or an anarchy, this couldn't have happened because in an anarchy, nobody gets to control that. Sure, there's crime, so people would still be stole from. You can say that's worse. But still, the problem of $800 just being stolen from everybody would never happen in an anarchy. And in a monarchy, this also wouldn't happen because the king is one guy. He doesn't need to steal $800 from all of these people because he has an interest in the society going forward, right? He's not just trying to get in power for himself. He has an interest in society as a whole because he has to rule this place for 80 years, and so do his kids, and so do his grandkids. So he can't go around stealing stuff from people. Otherwise, they might come around and kill him. Now, how do we avoid this problem? Well, in most cases, people usually avoid this problem by electing our fancy little friends known as politicians. You know, the suit and tie wearing people. Now, this leads us to the second problem with democracy, which is the politician problem. And the politician problem comes from the fact that politicians are complete scumbags, and nobody likes them. And this is because politicians are just out to make themselves more rich. So, what is a politician? Well, a politician is a representative of the people. When you go out and vote, you have an equal vote in order to pick your politician, and he represents you in the legislative body. Now, politicians are not good because when politicians exist, they create a problem. Remember the anarchy versus monarchy scenario I set up earlier? Well, in an anarchy, usually you have nobody ruling the country. So nobody can use force to take from you unless they directly break into your house and steal stuff from you, right? It's the only scenario where that could happen. And that does happen in anarchies because crime would happen more because there's no justice system. In a monarchy, the king might be bad or might be good. It's like a 50-50 shot. You know, there's really no way of telling. You could have a good guy or a bad guy, right? In ancient Rome terms, you could have Marcus Aurelius or you could have Nero. It's random. You have no way of deciding whether a king can be good or bad. And so because of that, sometimes you get good kings, and sometimes you get bad kings, or sometimes you get good emperors, and sometimes you get bad emperors. Stuff happens. It's random. But in a democracy, what essentially happens is that it's guaranteed, as Hans Hoppe says, that there will be intelligent bad guys as your leaders. Because all politicians are these intelligent bad guys. And the only way to get to the top of the political ladder is to be an intelligent bad guy. What do I mean by this? Well, to be a politician, you have to be kind of smart, right? I'm not saying they're geniuses, but you have to be kind of smart because you have to organize all these people and get this campaign moving, and you have to get this entire structure going. And so it's kind of hard to do that. So politicians have to be somewhat intelligent in order to organize all these people. Whereas kings could be as dumb as they want. They're born into the system. They could just be dumb bad guys. But why do I say bad guy? Because to be a politician, you have to be a liar, a cheat, you have to be a thief, you have to just destroy people's lives. That's what politicians do. And so politicians are all intelligent bad guys. The question is just, how much of a bad guy they are or how much I agree with what they say. But kings, on the other hand, they could be stupid bad guys, they could be smart bad guys, they could be good guys for a change, unlike in politics. So in this scenario, you really just have a problem with democracy, because democracy forces our leaders to be terrible people. So that's the second problem with democracy. The third problem is tyranny. So in a democracy, we usually think of democracy as a system that we use to avoid tyranny, right? We don't want tyranny in our lives, and that's why we create a democracy, because all of us decide, and when all of us come together to decide, we don't get anybody ruling over someone else. The problem is that that's not true, because in a democracy, we create laws, and so we have a lawmaking body, what we call the legislature. Now, do you remember our French friend Rousseau? Well, in France, guess what they did after the French Revolution? They created one legislature, and this is the democracy system. This is what everybody back then was talking about. It's the greatest example of democracy, of democratic values. John Adams talks about the people before the revolution who were calling for one legislative body as the ultimate expression of democracy. Well, guess what one legislative body does? That legislative body in France cut off everyone's heads and created the French Terror. The French Revolution was a disaster. It was the worst thing to happen in France probably ever. And because of democracy, you have that problem. Because if you have one concentrated legislative body, remember, the will of the people is made up bogus. It does not matter. It's fake. You have all of these politicians, and they come together in one body. Nothing's stopping them from doing anything. Of course they're going to go on a tear. Of course they're going to start killing people. Of course they're going to start stealing from people. They're politicians. You elected them and put them in one legislative body with no checks and balances at all. Because that's what democracy is. Democracy is just the pure will of the people. And of course, checks and balances are just ways to stop the will of the people from being enacted. So, if you live in a system without checks and balances, that's more democracy. And remember what we learned in kindergarten. Democracy is good. And so because democracy is good, more democracy is better. So, in the system of the most democracy with one legislative body, all you get is tyranny. Because nothing is there to protect your rights, nothing is there to balance the power, and nothing is there to stop the politicians from running your pockets. And so because of that, all democracy usually turns out to be, in the end, if it's a pure democracy, is tyranny. Because it can either be the tyranny of the legislative body, or the tyranny of the mob, or whatever tyranny you want to call it. It's tyranny, because nothing is holding the government back. Remember what Rousseau believes. Rousseau believes the government is the tool we use to get to the ideal state of mankind. So, if you hold the government back, you are evil. That's what Rousseau believes. And so government will have to be as big as possible, as strong as possible, as tyrannical as possible. And that all happens under democracy. The system we all learned was supposed to hold back tyranny. So democracy, in the end, fails. But there's one final problem with democracy that applies far more to us now, because this applies to basically every form of democracy. Once again, America is not a pure democracy. We are a republic, we have checks and balances, we have a separate judicial system, we have all of these pieces in place to hold back the problems of democracy. But in the end, we still can't avoid one problem, which is that if we don't have a society that's unified, if we don't have a unified culture, if we don't have one society that aims at something, whether that be prosperity or freedom or whatever, then all you have is a bunch of divided interest groups looking for power. And this is probably the biggest problem with democracy, is that it opens up the game of power to everybody. So before, the game of power was played between aristocrats and kings, and aristocrats and kings would try and fight each other in order to gain more power over each other. And that was problematic. I mean, the aristocrats and kings both, became pretty bad. They did some bad stuff to each other because of that. But really, it was limited to those classes, except for when they fought a war against each other. But in a democracy, what happens is that you just opened up the floodgates. You opened up the floodgates such that now every single person has the opportunity to gain power. And when that happens, the people will try to take it. You have a bunch of interest groups in our society, right? You see this with parties, right? You have Republicans and Democrats now, and libertarians. Nobody cares about them. But you have all these interest groups in societies, and this goes beyond parties. This goes into racial demographics. It goes into sexual demographics. It can go into who knows what. I mean, I'm pretty sure in Canada that they have something called the Rhinoceros Party, which wants to abolish the laws of physics. Basically, all a democracy does, with no unifying culture, or no unifying societal goal or vision, that is that it creates these interest groups. And when interest groups are created, all that does is pull apart a society. Because a society needs to be unified, otherwise it's not a society. If you have a society, that means you have one society. But if you create all these groups inside the society, and then they start fighting each other for power, all that's going to happen is that they start pulling apart. They start dividing. And so in America right now, you see this with the talk of national divorce, of civil war even. And that's what civil war was during the actual Civil War, slave versus free, North versus South. You had these dividing interest groups. And in that time, they were fighting for like a legitimate cause, for real problems. But the problem happens is that in democracy, the only way to solve the division is either to eliminate the interest groups or to fight it out. Because if you have interest groups vying for power, there is no way they're going to voluntarily disintegrate themselves. Somebody has to step in and eliminate them in some way. And the only way that happens in most democracies is civil war. So, a democracy, to sum up all the problems, has a participation problem where people get stolen from, a politician problem where evil bad guys get to the top of the power, a tyranny problem, which is that the evil bad guys at the top of the power ranking, who guessed, started violating people's rights. And finally, you have a division problem, which is that democracy itself, the very system, the existence of the system, tears apart a society and pulls it to the extremes. So how do we solve this? Well, great question myself. There are a couple ways that we can solve the democracy problem. Starting with participation, I think that the politician problem is really the only solution. You can't really do anything about participation other than have representative government. And so representative government is the best way to solve the participation problem. Now, the question is, how do we deal with the politician and tyranny problems? And this is actually pretty easy, is that you just create something like a constitution like we have in the modern day America, where you have a limiting factor that pits these politicians against each other so that they can't start stealing from the people. This isn't perfect because you can't imagine every scenario. For example, currently we have bureaucrats and independent agencies that control certain parts of our government that can still steal from people. For example, the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve just does mass inflation every once in a while and takes all the money from your bank accounts and puts it to whatever the government wants to spend. That's mass theft on a large scale, but other than that, you don't really have a problem where legislatures are going around cutting people's heads off, like in the French Revolution. So you can kind of use the balance of powers between executive and legislative and then add a separate judiciary to protect people's rights. And that really helps alleviate the problems in just pure democracy. In most countries, they try and do this, not very successfully. France still doesn't have a real separate legislature. Most countries have prime ministers, not presidents, and prime ministers are beholden to legislatures. So the prime ministers can be kicked out by a legislature with a vote of no confidence, and that happens all the time. So in a lot of countries, you don't really have the separate executive and legislative branches. You have something like a melding of the two, which is still a problem, but there's a little balance of power. Now, as long as you can establish that balance of power and create a separate judicial branch to establish real justice in a country, then you can have a working democratic republic, as I would call it, that can not steal everyone's stuff and not infringe on everyone's rights. But the final problem is a real problem for every country, every single democracy, every republic, because dividing interest will always exist. People just always have an interest in taking other people's stuff, in gaining more power. And as long as you allow people to think that that's okay, then they will do that. So the only solution we can have is to create a unified country. The only way you can stop a country from tearing at itself, that's a democracy, is by unifying it, is by allowing it to have a single core value, a single core message, an ideal to look up to. Because as long as we're all aiming at the same thing, we won't be reaching at each other's throats in order to grab what little power and resources are left. So, the name of this channel, once again, is Knowledge Matters, so I'd like all of you to please read something. Please read a book. There's a couple books that talk about democracy, the benefits of democracy, the downfalls of democracy. You have Democracy, the God That Failed by Hans Hermann Hoppe, which you probably won't be able to read because it has a lot of economic language in it, but it's a pretty good book. You have The Defense of the Constitutions of the United States, written by John Adams. John Adams is a great writer, a great founding father. Talked a lot about how to fix the problems in democracy and how the constitutions can really just unify and rally a country and create a system that works for everyone without having all the problems of a democracy. But beyond those two books, there are many other books about democracy, and you should read as many of them as you can. So, thank you.